Yeah, so now on to our final session of the conference. It's such a pleasure to welcome back Rebecca McMackin, longtime supporter of ELA and former board member and just really all around incredible person. Um, Rebecca McMackin is an ecologically obsessed horticulturist and garden designer. She's currently at the Arboretum, currently the Arboretum curator of Woodlawn Cemetery after completing the Loeb Fellowship at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Prior to this, she spent a decade as director of horticulture of Brooklyn Bridge Park, where she managed 85 acres of diverse parkland organically. Their research into cultivating urban biodiversity and ethical management strategies has influenced thousands of people and entire urban park systems to adopt similar approaches. So please join me in welcoming Rebecca McMackin.
Thank you, Ree. And hi, ELA. Hi, everyone. It is such an absolute honor to speak with you today. This group means so much to me. Decades ago, when I was a young gardener, ELA, along with the Xerxes Society, was one of the only ways that I was able to learn about ecological horticulture. There just wasn't the proliferation of workshops and webinars and books that thankfully exist today, really as a result of many folks who have been involved with ELA over the years. You will hear my parakeets that are rescues from Brooklyn Bridge Park opining in the background, Bubbles and Olive, if you're curious. So anyways, I was overjoyed to be given the opportunity to essentially report back on what we've built, on what you've built so far, as well as to assess our many possible futures and to encourage you to think and discuss more about our futures and share where I think this movement of ecological horticulture should go. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and get this pretty graphic up. Kapow. And another reason why I'm excited to speak for you today is that this is a conversation specifically for this group. It's not for the general public, it's for us, ecological landscape professionals, people who are trying to grow.
Yeah, I just started my like last session.
And it's surprisingly hard to find us. I gave this lecture to New Directions in the American Landscape, and I'm going to give it here, but really that is it. So my hope is that this talk sparks conversations, because we need to have them, and we need to be thoughtful and intentional about the directions we're headed. So my goal today is to give you some of the information that you will need in order to do that. So I've been working in public horticulture now for just under 2 decades. And in that short time, I've seen the practice change drastically, almost entirely for the better. I started as a gardener for the Parks Department in Brooklyn, where I was taught that horticulture was largely pruning forsythia, picking up trash, and finding the best bodegas between jobs. Back then, native plants were nearly impossible to find, and rarer still were folks interested in them. Even for those of us looking, information on native plants was hard to find. Wildlife gardening was something I was aware of, but it was sort of on par and sort of associated with permaculture. And there was this budding citizen science movement backed by the Xerxes Society to convince gardeners to track bees, but that was all that I knew. And the native plant landscapes that I was exposed to back then were wild and not aesthetically focused. Of course, there were practitioners like Daryl Morrison, Anthropocene, and Larry Weiner making gorgeous work for decades. But from my perspective, as a newbie working a city job, ecological horticulture was a fringe movement. It is incredible to see just how much has changed in that short time. Can you all see this slide change? Are you seeing a garden or are you seeing, there we go. All right. Native plants are now sold at box stores. Every single major newspaper wrote a piece on leaving the leaves this fall, and the Washington Post has made it their mission to destroy the American lawn. And we get to focus on increasing the availability of local ecotype seed in the commercial trade. It's easy to make the case that this movement has gone mainstream, thanks to the efforts of many of you. New gardeners are often lured into the profession by the idea of fostering biodiversity rather than having to search it out themselves. And still, I'm hopeful that this is really just the beginning. There is so much potential for broader reach. So today I'm going to help us take a look around to take stock of where we are as a movement. Mainly, I'm just going to ask a bunch of questions that can help us figure out where we want to go, what we can do better, and importantly, how we can avoid certain problematic positions that have befallen similar movements of the past, namely xenophobia, but also the inevitable results of making it in America, which include commercialization, greenwashing, and co-option. Why am I the person to do this? Arguably, I'm not. I'm a gardener / park manager / educator / designer, but I am not one of the researchers who study how to get more people engaged in this work. But I've read their research, as I had the opportunity to do a year-long fellowship, which I used to study science communication and the history of native plant movements in the US and Europe. So this lecture today is my best attempt to put all of that together, to look at where we are, help us avoid potential pitfalls, and share some of the tools that I found to be most helpful when encouraging people to get on board. So who are we? What are we even doing? Broadly, it seems that there is a global movement focused on designing and managing land for biodiversity that is a response to declining biodiversity. So in the US, our biodiversity-oriented horticulture work places an emphasis on the plants and animals that evolved here, but that is not the case everywhere. Many UK gardeners practice rewilding, which has become a very common term to describe everything from ecological restoration to landscape design. I literally heard it used a week ago to sell face moisturizer. It was like, rewild your facial flora. But the term really describes a specific movement out of the UK that promotes landscape biodiversity, but has a sort of opposite approach to the work that we do here, and arguably even different definitions of key terminology. I heard a founder of the rewilding movement lecture recently, and she not only rejected the value of native plants, but also referred to an entirely Mediterranean garden as biodiverse. She was even weeding out ruderal native plants to protect that biodiversity. Rewilding also uses animals the way that we use plants, placing them back in the landscape and relying on them to engineer ecosystems that then allow the plants to return. She showed a picture of a bunch of volunteers with loppers hacking at scrubby growth to mimic the foraging of Pleistocene megafauna. It is a very different outlook. This is our rewilding picture. A term I'm just starting to hear, but honestly love, is conservation gardening. I was introduced to it in a paper out of Germany, and it seems that it's quite similar to our movement here. They focus on native plants, urban ecology, and more than we do on ex situ conservation, or getting rare and endangered plants into the commercial trade. This chart is from a paper in Science that included, along with all references, that is included, I'm sorry, with all of the references for this lecture in the handout that is actually just a bibliography. This image is actually from an online application that researchers made to help people select and source rare native plants for their gardens and balconies. And as cool as that is, there is still a strong sentiment in Germany, where I was able to visit and meet with designers and historians this summer, that the ideology behind prioritizing native plants is in fact dangerous. And this is because of the way that native plants and organic farming were weaponized by the Third Reich, using ecological purity to rationalize ethnic cleansing and genocide. More on this later. Europe also began the new perennial movement, or Dutch wave of naturalistic design. It's fundamentally an aesthetic movement, but the popularity of this look, led by Pete Dolph and others, made a lot of our ecological work possible in that it's now mainstream to plant perennials closely together and leave seed heads up during the winter. I'd also argue that the trendiness of North American plant species in high-end British and European garden design popularized those same species in North America. Tom Stewart Smith has an entire section of his estate dedicated to North American meadow plants. And James Hitchmont has published multiple papers on the establishment of North American prairie plants. I ripped this picture out of Gardens Illustrated just last month. And aside from the teasel, it's just asters and goldenrods. And I'm not a nationalist at all, but part of me is still like, why does Germany have the best cultivars of New England aster? It is totally unfair. I won't bore you with it, but I spend a lot of time thinking about whether our movement is actually of this land, or if it's just another imported colonial trend like so much of American horticulture to date. Anyway, the Dutch have also had native plant gardens for a century now. They're called Heem parks. They started in the 1930s as a sort of educational display and quickly spread through public landscapes as they became more ornamental. They are heavily managed and similar to places like Mount Cuba, where there will be an example of a wetland and then a tiny meadow. Here in North America, there are a bunch of movements, or perhaps a bunch of names for one movement. And I think we should take a moment to figure out if this is ideal. Maybe we want to just pick a name and run with it. I like ecological horticulture. I think it's accurate, it's fun to say, and it captures the level of sophistication required to do this work. I've heard critiques that it's elitist, that it isn't welcoming. And to me, that seems totally fair and a good argument for the term ecological gardening. That seems more accessible to new practitioners. But I still feel like there should be some sort of way to differentiate those of us who are professionals who do research from those people planting echinacea from Home Depot. I would love to hear your thoughts on this later. Past common terms include wildlife gardening, which was popular when I started out. And again, I just associate with less aesthetic landscapes. I also don't like that the entire focus of the term is on animals. And there's permaculture, of course, which I think is a good example of a trend that faded out. So maybe we can find some lessons there that we can avoid. Permaculture held problematic positions. Early practitioners actively planted invasive species rationalized by their benefit to humanity. They were also critiqued as a group of mainly white people appropriating indigenous knowledge for their own aims, something that I know we all grapple with and should. I've also been hearing regenerative gardening more and more, a few times at this conference, which relates, of course, to regenerative agriculture. But I worry it's just slightly too abstract to ever have mass appeal. So in general, it might be better to pick a single term, or it might be better intentionally not to, as a single movement might be seen as a trend. A single name might also tie this work to problematic figureheads. While a movement without a name is free to take the shape of any local community interested in gardening for biodiversity. Again, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But whatever you call it, this work has become wildly popular. In 2023, the National Gardening Survey claims that 80% of US households take part in garden and lawn activities. But that accounts for houseplants, hardscaping, and of course, turf care. A more realistic statistic seems to be that 55% of US households garden. That is still more than 185 million people, 1/3 of whom are millennials. That is the biggest age group. The COVID pandemic encouraged 18.3 million people to begin gardening for the very first time in 2021 alone. That became 20 million new gardeners over the course of the next 2 years. The National Gardening Survey claims that these new gardeners are younger and more economically and ethnically diverse than in the past. I wish I had actual numbers to share with you, but the report costs $4,000. If you have it, please send it to me. But the research seems to show that these new gardeners are sticking with it. According to Axiom, a free garden survey group, garden center sales had big gains in 2021 and 22 and stayed steady in 23. And new gardeners overwhelmingly reported their intentions to continue and expand their gardening. I was pretty shocked to see how many gardeners buy their plants mainly at big box stores. New gardeners were even higher than this, with only 11% shopping at garden centers. But even still, The numbers on ecological gardening look great. They're so good that I have trouble accepting them. The National Wildlife Federation, here we go, hired the National Gardening Survey to ask people about gardening starting in 2019, and found that in 2021, 1/3 of US adults plan to purchase plants to help wildlife, with a full quarter of the US population buying native plants specifically. That's more than 80 million people. It seems like the possibility for bias is high here, given the aim of the survey, but they surveyed more than 2,000 people, and they also had big percentages of gardeners buying organic products and killing their lawns. So I was skeptical, but then I found an academic study of 2,000 gardeners that, according to your definition of the word moderately, either half of gardeners thought native plants were important or 80% did. The researcher also found that 58% of gardeners had purchased native plants in the previous year, which gets us to 107 million people, roughly 1/3 of the US population, and higher than the National Gardening Survey. And a survey that I thought I had brought to show you and apparently left upstairs. Oh, wait, here it is. I just found it yesterday, and it's not in the bibliography, but I can put it. It's called Perceptions and Socioeconomic Status Influence Purchases of Native Plants. And it doesn't come out till April, but I'll put the link in the chat after the lecture. They found that number of homeowners had creeped up to 60%. So that means that 60% of all homeowners had purchased a native plant in 2022. And that equals 138 million people in the United States. So it seems like this is real and totally mainstream. And as you might expect, the study also showed that the more likely gardeners were to prioritize native plants, the more likely they were to compost, collect rainwater, garden organically, and a whole host of other ecologically oriented practices. This researcher also showed that while gardeners go to box stores for plants in general, they go to independent garden centers for native plants. And the number one motivation for planting native plants was, of course, pollinators, which is cool, but I think we've got some work to do adding in more of the benefits of the native plants themselves. My sense is that this pollinator angle came on the heels of the public's concern over colony collapse disorder. Researchers went to work trying to correct for the mistaken focus on honeybees by adding in native bees, and that campaign actually worked. So everyone was just trying to feed the bees for a few years there. And then the messaging seemed to have broadened to pollinators, to include monarchs and other butterflies. And these days we're seeing more focus on planting for birds, which is all awesome and wonderful. But what I see missing from the public awareness, at least, is a concern for the plants themselves. Our messaging is currently wrapped up in animals eating plants, which might just be the result of Doug Tallamy being an entomologist, and that the organizations out there educating people are the Xerces Society, the National Wildlife Federation, and the Audubon Society, all animals, which, for me, these plants evolved on this land. There's something to be said about making space for them regardless of if anyone eats them or not. Like the Germans making lists of rare plants for balconies and gardens, a push for more garden-level conservation of rare species could be amazing if done properly. And I think our native flora is charismatic enough to get behind it enthusiastically. Because more homeowners need to plant the plants that evolved here. Many of us are professionals. We work for organizations or firms. My work is entirely in public horticulture, but home gardeners are so incredibly important for both ecological and social change. The fantastic Humanity for Habitat paper that came out last year found that there is roughly 2.3 million square kilometers of yard in the United States. That is larger than 3 Texases. While the research on biodiversity decline is only getting scarier. You all already know that there's evidence to suggest that we've lost 45% of arthropods on planet Earth in the last few decades. Researchers also estimate that we're losing from 1 to 2% per year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up to an additional third of insects on the planet disappearing in the next 20 years. People who I know who worked on that study thought it was overly optimistic due to a flaw in the surveying process. And a report that came out in Nature just last month found that actually it's even worse among formerly abundant species. Insects that used to have very large populations, those that we think of as common, are declining at 8% per year. Those are the insects that feed the birds. Again, you probably already know that even seed-eating birds like chickadees eat around 500 insects a day. Researchers think that the lack of insects is one major factor driving the bird declines of the last 50 years, during which time, of course, you're all well versed in these statistics, but we've lost a third of North American birds, most of whom are insectivores. So those three Texases are so crucial. And even those of us working in public and professional realms should be supporting the evolution of home gardening as much as possible. Because as critical as it is for plants and wildlife, gardening is also important for people. Certainly, the health benefits of gardening have been proven many times over. There's a book called The Well-Gardened Mind that just lists all of it. My favorite study was one 2 years ago in which 3 to 5-year-olds in Finland had sections of their daycare outdoor space changed from hardscape to greenery and were encouraged to play in the dirt and care for plants. They saw their immune system function and microbiome increase within a month. Researchers used the study to speculate that the reason so many of us are suffering from immune-related deficiencies is because of a lack of access to biodiversity. This relates directly to the environmental racism that we see across the country, in which historically redlined communities and those with less money also have less access to biodiversity than wealthier, whiter communities. It's called the luxury effect. A study out of LA in 2020 found that bird species in the city were literally racially segregated. Everyone deserves to live in a healthy ecosystem. Everyone deserves birdsong and healthy soils. But there's also something about the act of gardening ecologically which seems politically significant for the gardeners themselves. We're living through some pretty wild times. And all indications are that things are just going to get more unstable environmentally, climatically, and economically. And I think a lot of Americans have come to rely on a system of change that focuses on political representation and expects the government, various organizations, even corporations sometimes, to make the changes that we all want to see. So there's something so beautiful about people just doing it themselves. There's a phrase that I love out of organizing, which is "we save ourselves." And it's sort of radical to reject the disempowerment that we're fed every day. And I just love that part of gardening. I see it as a form of direct action, and such a beautiful action at that because it's collective. It connects people back to all of the other organisms that so many Americans live their lives without. And it helps people understand that they can be part of these systems, that they can be helpful and support the plants and animals who support us. I have a lot of friends who like to fight about dandelions on the internet. I have been known to fight about dandelions on the internet. It's like a sign of spring these days that we all start bickering when No Mow May approaches. And my controversial opinion is that No Mow May is actually awesome. Not because it's doing anything that ecologically beneficial, although there is a bit of evidence to say that it helps while the lawn is unmown. And challenging aesthetics is totally central to this work. So getting people comfortable with unmown lawns is legitimately helpful. But the real benefit is that with No Mow Mayers, we are watching the very first baby steps of thousands and thousands of people towards actually taking care of their land. Yes, dandelion seeds are spreading everywhere, and there's this sort of neglect element that isn't helpful, but those No Mow May people are so gettable, even when they're misguided. That inclination to help is a precious seed. And it's our job to take those well-intentioned folks and guide them into the work that creates actual ecological benefit. But doing that, getting people to change behavior is a lot of work. There's research on how to do it, but it takes so much effort. Researchers in New Zealand worked with 55 gardeners over the course of a year, visiting them 8 times. And by the end of it, only 26% changed the way that they gardened. A study in Australia found that if you want to get people who are not already on board to modify their gardening, you had to provide site assessments and free plants, which seems doable, but who's going to do that? Maybe the ELA. There are also groups, of course, like Wild Ones and Pollinator Pathway, who seem well positioned to take that on. Or we could create an entirely new system similar to the Master Gardener certification that contains a community outreach component. I couldn't find research on the way that gardeners use extension agents recently, but my sense is that they're inaccessible to new gardeners. The man who runs Axiom surveys told me that they were too old of face to talk to younger gardeners, which I'm not sure I believe. But I wonder how ecologically minded extension agents are, and if they're more used to talking about turf fertilizer and pesticides than native plant benefits. Another study suggested homeowners associations as vehicles for change, which seems great, but reaching them remains incredibly difficult. Research by Kelly Larson out of Arizona has shown that many homeowners have sophisticated levels of environmental awareness and still don't garden ecologically. She even found that when people had high opinions of native plants, their yards still contained less than 1/3 of them. She goes so far as to recommend that campaigns to raise awareness of ecological benefits might not work, and that better strategies would include marketing that highlights the low maintenance requirements and low water usage of native plants, as well as just making the plants cheaper and more available. There is, though, a body of work related to changing behavior more generally, and I had the good fortune to study some of it during my fellowship. One of the key factors is inspiring self-motivation rather than foisting actions on others. People need to make the choice to act themselves. Issues have to be framed to show how they benefit individual actors rather than external factors like the environment. This is a tough one that I know we all struggle with, because so many of us see that over-obsession with our individual wants and needs as a big part of the problem here. And there's something inherently exhausting about telling people over and over how much better their lives will be with butterflies. I would much prefer to yell that butterflies deserve to live here just as much as we do, and who are you to literally pour poison on the soil? But it has been proven to be less effective as a communication technique. I know, of course, because I've tried it. So as much as it might pain us, the Trojan horse method of communicating about ecological horticulture is effective. We lure them in with more beautiful houses, secure food systems, and the delight of their own child watching a butterfly eclose. At the Harvard Kennedy School, I had the opportunity to take a class with Marshall Gans, who was a civil rights organizer who worked for Cesar Chavez and SNCC in the 1960s. He taught us this strategy that he calls the empathetic bridge, that many of the great speeches of all time follow, and it can inspire people to act. Little did he know that I planned to use the technique on gardeners and my unwitting 9-year-old son, but I found it to be incredibly effective, even when it's formulaic. So an example of one of our arguments using the empathetic bridge might go, number 1, acknowledge the challenge. We are facing a biodiversity crisis of catastrophic proportions. Number 2, express empathy. It can be so scary to feel like there's nothing we can do to create a world that will be safe for our children. 3, narrate hope. But ecological gardening can bring biodiversity and butterflies back into your own very yard, community garden, or fire escape. 4, enable choice. So will you join me in getting your hands dirty and planting flowers for the future? It can be cheesy. And wow, does it feel ingenuine. But with some thought, it can also be more elegant and heartfelt. Now that you know it, you'll hear it in like every Obama speech of all time because all their writers went to the Kennedy School and took that class. And it's also just super effective. I used the strategy when I gave a TED Talk in October. And again, it totally worked, at least from an audience response measure. It was a little overwhelming. People literally cried. And I'm a bit of a ham, of course, but I think so much of that response was that people are so eager for hope and so eager for things that they can do that actually matter. And giving that to them is this incredible gift. It made me think about how often we talk to other gardeners and how many folks, likely millions and millions, would be thrilled to start gardening for biodiversity, but it has literally never occurred to them. And it's hard to do. When I was crafting the TED Talk, the vast majority of the work was translating the concepts and phrases that we all take for granted to an audience, many of whom did not know that a butterfly used to be a caterpillar. You can't say words like herbivore. And you can't communicate the ever-present uncertainty of the scientific community. I couldn't say there's evidence to suggest that. I had to say, we've lost 45% of insects on the planet. And I checked in with the people who did those studies to get input on phrasing, and they were like, okay, fine, but this is why we don't like to talk to the general public. The general public is also sometimes the client, of course. And the same techniques can be used to reach both groups. In the end, it's storytelling. I believe in the power of good storytelling, and we can all get better at it. The plants that I remember from my youth are the plants that I heard stories about. The buttercup that told my sisters if they like butter, the Queen Anne's lace with the central drop of blood, and the honeysuckle with a dollop of nectar when you pulled out the stamen. All those plants are invasive, of course, but those are the plants that I grew up with in rural Connecticut. And as a child, I loved to share that knowledge with other kids. It's when you get that transfer of stories and information from child to child that you know that the plants are sewn into the fabric of the culture. I think we have those stories with native plants. They're all around us. We have skunk cabbage that generates its own heat and makes little stinky rooms for its pollinating flies. We have jewelweed seed pods that explode and delight literally everyone. And we have mountain laurel stamens that, when triggered, spring out from a sticky circus tent to bop bumblebees on the back. I love pollination ecology. I think those stories, the ones that show people how to read flowers, are the most powerful because they animate plants so effectively. As an illustration, I'm going to show you how I like to tell the story of Aquilegia canadensis. This, as you all know, is the Eastern red columbine. They're arguably the most cheerful of our spring wildflowers, but of course they are not flowering for us. Their bloom heralds the return of the ruby-throated hummingbird, the East Coast's only hummingbird. After these tiny birds have flown thousands of miles on their migration from Central America to the Northeast, they rely on the sugary nectar of the red columbine to refuel, and they have reason to believe that this flower will be waiting for them when they arrive. The columbine stores their nectar at the end of long spurs, where only the long tongues of the hummingbird can reach it. As the birds drink the nectar, they pollinate the flower. Both organisms benefit, and in fact, the red columbine, the hummingbird, excuse me, is the red columbine's pollinator partner. The bird and the flower could not be more charming, but it's in the dynamics between the two where the real magic resides. Birds have an extra photoreceptor that allows them to see red incredibly well, whereas bees cannot. Flowers have taken advantage of this and use the color red to communicate, which is why nearly every red flower you see is bird pollinated. So as the ruby-throated hummingbird flies over land on their journey, a wave of red flowers blooms to greet them. This beautiful dance of symbiosis is happening all around us, among plants and animals that have evolved together for thousands, if not millions of years. In return for planting native plants, we get a front row seat to the wonders of the natural world. It's hard work, but it's the best kind because at the end of our efforts, not only do we get biodiversity, but we get butterflies. So that is how we suck people in. But there is still more work to do in guiding them towards really meaningful gardening once they are motivated and ideologically on board. We fought long and hard for people to recognize the importance of planting native plants. But now that so many people understand that, I'm hopeful that there is room to go farther than those echinacea cultivars from Home Depot, which when you consider supply chains are quite likely causing more ecological damage than they support. Especially as this movement gains momentum and economic weight, we have to be incredibly careful about sticking to recommendations that foster real ecological functionality, rather than creating complacency after not mowing a lawn for a month, for example. My brother is a fancy farm-to-table chef, and I've been tracking the way that the ecological gardening movement has mirrored the local organic food movement for decades. They're similar in many ways. My husband and I used to teach soil science every year at the Young Farmers Conference at Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture in upstate New York, and we'd get to stay for lectures and, of course, meals. And one year, it was like 2012 or 2013, they had a keynote speaker who was this obnoxious guy who was a host from this NPR show called Planet Money. And he was there, as he saw it, to put the fear of God into young ideological farmers. He was there to tell us that big ag was coming for us. And he delighted in telling everyone this to the extent that he got booed. But what he had to say was right on. He said that now that the financial benefits of organic farming were apparent, people should get ready to lose their organic farms, because big ag would simply pivot to take over that section of the market. These massive corporations might not be a small farm, but they can certainly print one on their carton of eggs and sell for less than $2 than yours, and guess what people will buy? I haven't had the capacity to research stats on organic farming, but when we look at the comparative power of NOFA versus Whole Foods, you can guess who's winning out. And we either will face or are currently facing those same challenges, with Monrovia, Syngenta, Scott's Miracle-Gro, and every other bad actor in the industry now claiming to support our efforts, even funding them. What we've built so far is truly valuable, truly helpful, and it is worth protecting. But the more successful we get, the more we risk this movement being co-opted. I've been having a bunch of conversations with people recently about whether or not it would be good for Martha Stewart to get wholesale into native plants, as it seems like she might be doing at this very moment, and I remain skeptical. The NPR guy's suggestion to get ahead of this was to think about the elements of your work that can't be co-opted and play them up. And when we apply those ideas to horticulture, they sound like smart things to do regardless. Farmers responded to big ag takeovers by encouraging people to get to know their farmer. Can you imagine if we had a Get to Know Your Grower initiative in which gardeners all over the country were encouraged to go befriend folks at plant centers and nursery people? Many of us in the professional realms already take those relationships very seriously, but highlighting that for home gardeners could also be fantastic. We could see more nurseries selling plants at farmers markets. We could find out which growers treat their workers well and which use fewer synthetics. Another technique to avoid co-option might be to shift the focus of our efforts away from buying plants. Of course, buying plants is often necessary and incredibly fun, but it still furthers the commodification of living organisms. And I just don't love the individual consumer choice model of social or environmental change. Plants are plants. People can grow them from seed. It's such a magical thing to see a plant that you started flower for the very first time. Plants can also be shared. We can give them away. This is a picture of an event my family and a couple neighborhood kids held each year in Brooklyn, in which we'd give people one plant for each action they took towards a social justice initiative. It was called Free Plants for Justice, and we gave away hundreds and hundreds of the plants we just pulled out of our gardens. We also might consider broadening this movement from a strict focus on the repair of environmental damage to also include the prevention of environmental damage. Here in Connecticut, our forest floors are carpeted with barberry and burning bush, but only barberry is prohibited, and even still you can find it in every Home Depot. A new study from just last month shows exactly how harmful nursery sales of invasive plants are currently, and will get even worse with climate change. The dialogue around invasive plants in horticulture lumps these plants being sold now in with plants that escaped cultivation years ago, but they're not the same. One is worse and easier to solve for. Home gardeners could also be working to remove known invasives from the commercial trade. It's not easy to do because nurseries lobby their representatives, but garden clubs, birders, land conservancies, and yes, the ELA could do that as well. There's a part of ecological gardening that always makes me a bit uncomfortable. It seems sometimes like we're trying to paper over this vast amount of environmental damage with pretty gardens, while that damage continues unabated. And it's wonderful to see groups like this conference platform people who place landscape within a political and historical context, like we've seen both today and yesterday. And it's wonderful that we're all thinking about how our work ties back into movements like the land back movement or redlining. Because some of the exotic and even invasive plants that many of us are used to railing against are here for very good reasons, and they're different than the barberry at Home Depot. Seeds were sown into the hair of African women hundreds of years ago before they were forced on ships carrying them here. Queen Anne's lace seeds are an abortifactant that Europeans relied on for centuries. And the way things are going these days, we might consider keeping some of them around. I've come to follow the advice of my friend James Golden when it comes to invasive plants and just accept reality. They're here, sometimes they need to be removed, but they're still here, which again contrasts sharply from those invasive plants still being sold for profit. That harsh dichotomy between native and invasive, we should all really sit with, and I know many of you have. I spent a lot of time during my fellowship trying to figure out if this was a healthy way to see the world, or if it's a worldview that might be replicating harmful ideologies. Which, I want to be clear, I am 100% on board with native plants. I am on that team. But that dichotomy and the ideology that some organisms are inherently bad and that we are the arbiter is something that turns a lot of people away. I had a conversation with my friend Dario one time, and he's this incredibly fabulous, wildly successful Black artist. And I was trying to explain why invasive plants were bad. And he just looks at me after I'm done talking and is like, wait, you're telling me that a bunch of plants were brought here against their will, and rather than dying like you want them to, they just effing thrived, and now they're evil because of that? And I was just face to face with the limits of our message to reach a broad and diverse audience, as well as some new realizations about my problematic worldviews. Many of us, of course, already recognize that demonizing a plant is foolish. And when we use phrases like destroying Japanese knotweed, there are folks who are going to respond to that with understandable aversion, even fear. But that language also hides the hand of specific groups of people and colonialism and capitalism and environmental exploitation in creating the conditions we're trying to repair. Those forces need to be named so that we can change them. That dichotomy can also foster xenophobia, which is sometimes a problem in the native plant movement from my perspective. Anytime I hear the phrase American plants for American gardens, I recoil. It just sounds like nationalism, rather than a movement based on the land or just the place where we are. And as I mentioned, native plants have been weaponized in the past. People sometimes joke about native plant Nazis, but their names were Alwyn Seifert and Heinrich Wieping, and they worked closely with Heinrich Himmler to create the Autobahn, and went so far as to recommend native plants to camouflage foxholes during World War II. When you dig into the way that the Third Reich used native plants to rationalize their own superiority, literally weeding out labeled invasive people, it is both incredibly scary and very important for our movement to be aware of. However, the intent behind their strategy is fundamentally different from the threat of a similar ideology gaining ground here, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Hitler himself was apparently embarrassed by the lack of achievements of the ancient Germans. He felt Greeks, Romans, and Nordic people were more advanced thousands of years ago, and saw the Germanic connection to the land as a way to mythologize their past culture in order to build a stronger national identity. That disdain for anything foreign had been building for a century and was brought into the landscape realm by author Willy Pasteur, who in the early 1900s connected German trees and soils to the race of the people. His good friend, Willy Lang, is often mentioned in histories of naturalistic design uncritically, even though he was the first person to translate these ideas into actual landscapes. They removed rhododendrons, railed against formalism, and cultivated the concept of landscape purity. The soil in Blood and Soil was organic. But interestingly enough, Lang still used exotic plants on occasion because their movement was about myth-making, politics, and culture, but it wasn't really about ecology. It was just a tactic to aid fascism. Mussolini also reportedly flirted with a native plant movement, convincing peasants that they had to return to the land and be strong workers. But in the end, he just starved and killed everyone, so they didn't really put as much effort into it. So it's important to know this and watch for it as our movement here grows. I see it in just bits and pieces, and am honestly surprised we don't hear more about our patriotic duty to plant native. But I'm concerned that the idea of keeping out alien plants fits right into the rhetoric of white supremacy that has recently become so commonplace. We should all be on the lookout for this and quash it when it arises. That said, the claim that a prioritization of the plants that evolved here is somehow akin to our racist immigration policies is, of course, fundamentally untrue and often made in bad faith. What happened in Germany does not equate easily to North America or really any colonial context. If white supremacists in the US wanted to pursue a similar strategy, they would not use native plants to prove their right to the land. They'd use European plants and cover this land with them, which can easily describe most of the history of American horticulture. Many of us see this work as an expression of environmental justice. So how do we promote native plants without fanning the flames of fascism? Again, I would love to hear your ideas in the Q&A, but I try to use better words and terms. I talk more and more about ecological functionality rather than making the assumption that people will conflate native with better. I'm using the terms native, exotic, and invasive with you all because you're professionals, but I rarely use them with the general public and only alongside of a definition. I never make the assumption that people will automatically think the word exotic means bad. And others are doing this as well. I listened to an interview with Uli Lorimer from the Native Plant Trust last month in which he didn't say the word invasive one time. He said plants that cause ecological harm. And it was just that much more effective. And I think more of us can adopt this approach when we're outside of spaces like this conference. It will allow this movement to reach a far broader audience. And who knows, it might just save us from red, white, and blue native plant displays. So to wrap up this long and winding assessment of where we are right now, I want to take time to also consider public ecological horticulture, my one true love. I had the good fortune to hear Nicole Thomas from the Urban Health Lab in Pennsylvania lecture recently on the effect of urban greening to lower neighborhood gun violence. And as many of you know, the results are dramatic. Researchers saw crime go down 29% in the areas around cleaned up and planted formerly abandoned lots. People around the lots felt safer and less depressed and went outside to socialize more. The authors hypothesized that by showing people that their environment was cared for, they themselves felt less neglected. And that part of this movement about care and stewardship brings me so much hope, because sometimes it's hard for me to remember that this work is important. With the climate, with everything happening in Palestine and the Middle East, it can be hard to focus on gardens and landscapes. They can feel frivolous. When I get that way, I like to return to an experience I had last June when I went to check in on a new garden I designed with Brooke Clausen for the Brooklyn Museum. We installed it in May, and this photo was from June, which was my first visit to see it since. However, on that day, you could not see the sun, and the air smelled like fire. It was the second day of the effects of the Canadian wildfires finding their way to New York City, and it was apocalyptic. Even though people were still using the garden, they took care of their kids, looked at flowers, drank coffee. I counted 5 species of native bees and the smog. It was totally surreal. And I thought that day that we should all quit our jobs and go do something that more directly upped our chances of planetary survival. I literally started arguing with my friends about it. I eventually got so upset that I called my husband, Chris Roddick, who was the head of arboriculture at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden for 30 years. And he's a super grounded guy. And he reminded me that outside of the Cherry Blossom Festival, the single busiest week he ever saw at the garden was the week after 9/11. Because gardens get more important when the world is on fire, not less. There are sanctuaries, same as they've always been, and they can be sanctuaries for bumblebees as well. And it's because of this that public gardens are so important. Most of us have always known that, and the world finally realized it during COVID lockdown. We're seeing more public gardens popping up, but there's still so often just such precious things, fundamentally distinct from people's actual environments. I'm inspired by a movement that Chris Fellhaber from Chanticleer started to get gardens outside of gates and fences, to cultivate gardens that are part of the fabric of people's daily lives and make their environment more beautiful and healthy. I love this garden that we did at the museum because it's a garden for people walking their kids to school and for hot dog vendors. I literally asked the hot dog vendors what they thought of the garden, and they were super into it. And they deserve beauty. They deserve the awe and delight of watching a butterfly unfurl her proboscis to drink, or a bee backing out of a penstemon flower. We intentionally placed those plants that would attract charismatic insects by benches, hoping to facilitate those interactions. There's an old socialist rallying cry of bread and roses that I've used to guide my work for the past 2 decades. And it refers to the fact that people have a right to the basics of a dignified life, that everyone deserves food and housing and healthcare, but they also deserve beauty. We all need art and music and flowers. And I see that as my job, providing roses for the people and the bees and the many caterpillars who eat rose leaves, which is my extra flowery way of saying that this work is so important. And we need to do what we can to make sure it's not just a trend, but becomes just what horticulture is. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. What a delight and thought-provoking and great talk. I have like a page of things that I wrote, none of which are questions, but just like tidbits that you said that I want to just keep and sort of log away in my head. The chat has been full of folks with lots of comments appreciating your questions and really praising your talk. There's the one sort of specific question that came out was do you have a reference for the empathetic bridge? Do you have a reference on the Kennedy School approach that you could share with us? That we could read or learn from.
What if I just like screenshot that? Oh, you know what? Yes, I think there is actually a proper reference in the bibliography. I could be wrong on that. And if not, I will post it so you can all see it. But I took that image in class, but I did Google around and it is widely available on the internet. So I will find something and put it in the chat.
Excellent. Great. Thanks so much. I also, one thing that I think I'm sure many folks who are, practitioners here have found with as there's as this movement has become more mainstream and more popular, part of what that has meant is that there's a lot more competition for plants in the nursery trade as well, even from the the more local nurseries that many of us might be working with that are wholesale versus like a wholesale / retail nurseries. So I don't know if I have a specific question, but maybe other than just to name that as there is this growing interest, like part of what we are seeing is the stress on the sort of supply and demand of plants. Like I know around the Boston area, we've had like a hard time finding Carex pennsylvanica that is who knew that was going to get so popular that it would be hard to find, or yeah.
Mount Cuba test results are a death knell for whatever they recommend. It's like you can't get them anymore. Good luck with Carex woodii. That one's like not in the trade for 3 years. And it's totally like there's conferences about that specifically, like finding native plants is a huge issue. The industry has not responded, which is maybe a good thing, right? Like in certain ways, if they did ramp up production to the levels that consumers demand, it might be that those production methods are actually really bad and toxic. And so right now, most of the native plant producers that I know of really try to limit fertilizers, fungicides, et cetera. Like they're ideologically driven beyond commercial. And so there is an element there that we want to be able to preserve that. But it's a huge problem. And when you look into the research on native plants that is published, I was surprised to find that there's 2 big categories. There's one category that I presented a lot of information on today, which is about people's perceptions of native plants and whether or not they plant them and what drives that, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other half of it is about the nursery trade. And that is driven by nurseries themselves who do tons and tons of research about, both people's perceptions, but also seed sourcing, all of those issues that are making that bottleneck in the market. There's a lot of information on that. And I found there's not a lot of data from the last few years, but I found a study in 2008 that said that 10% of all plants sold in the US in I'm sorry, it was 2018, were native plants, which that's a big number. But then they said that a previous study from 2007 found that it was 17% of all plants sold in the US were native. And so I don't trust either one of those numbers. I think that that industry is probably using some really poor definitions of native, I'd have to imagine. And again, like I would not consider a lot of plants that are sold at box stores to truly be supporting this movement. And so it's hard to parse those numbers out. But I think from my perspective, the real hope is just that, so many people want to do the right thing and they are hampered by low information. They don't have the information that they need. They don't have the channels to get information that they need. So many people get their information from TikTok. It's terrifying, right? Like so many people. And I went on TikTok one time to try and be like, what is this? What are the kids doing? Let's see what the native plant people are into. It was horrifying. It was like misinformation. Just like someone's like, I'm Cynthia and I'm going to plant a tree. Come along with me. And it's just like disaster, right? And like, it's not a forum. I mean, there are people who are experts, but they don't have the followings often of those kind of home people. And so we need to figure out ways to reach people with real information. We need to figure out those bottlenecks and then provide people with plants that both, scratch that itch of having the thing that they want, but also provide real ecological benefit. I love the idea of directing people towards their local native plant society, right? And that instead of going and buying an object at a store, they're meeting other people in a community and then fostering those relationships and then growing plants themselves that are divided. And so it's not an instant gratification, right? And it's not going to grow the movement as quickly as if we could convince Martha Stewart to adopt this, which she very well might. Like, she's kind of in the process of doing that right now. If you've watched any of her blog or social media over the last month, she's like hanging out with Uli, and like it's happening. And so we'll see where that goes. But yeah, so there's all different methods. But I think, again, we should grow slowly and carefully. We should protect what we've got more than anything.
Great. Sorry, I was having a hard time unmuting. So another question that came up, do you have a list of better, more effective, more motivating terms to motivate personal action? Any others, as well as ecological functions?
It's, I like to say the terms that I like are the plants that evolved on this land. I think that is very, again, it's like so nerdy that I don't know that it's going to appeal to so many folks, but I really like that phrase because it clarifies a lot of confusing things. And when you say the phrase like native plant, you're making so many assumptions, right? That people are going to assume that that is good, right? Why would a native plant be good? You haven't given them the contextual information to tell them about the relationships that those plants have, the fact that they did evolve here, the fact that they've been pushed off their land. Like, those are the kinds of things that we need to convey. And the word native for us conveys all that information, but it doesn't read that way for so many people. And so, it's hard to pick a word or a term because it's like a couple sentences, right? But I think that that's where storytelling comes in. That's where showing examples, right? Picking an example of a flower and an organism, and especially butterflies, right? I think butterflies are just the gateway into all of this work that people can grasp onto. But I would love to hear ideas from other people. Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen and bring up all of your beautiful faces. If you no pressure, if you want to remain anonymous, that's totally cool.
Can I ask your opinion on what you think of the keystone plants, the term keystone?
Oh, I think it's great. I love it. And it is a very important concept that is wonderfully getting popularized, right? It's so good. It does refer to only certain plants though, right? It's not even like native plants. It's just this tiny subset of native plants. And again, it's one of those things that's kind of advanced. But that idea, if you can do one thing, plant an oak tree, what a great package of information, right? It's just like got a bow on it. The way that Doug Tallamy does that little package can just fly through our culture, and people can pick that up. So I think keystone species is a fantastic term.
Well, and there's something to be said for like using more words to describe what you're talking about to sort of show the nuance of what's happening. Like even the word invasive plant has, every state has its definition of how it's categorized. And so thinking about, plants that cause ecological harm is, one of those category, like one of the criteria that's used to create that word. But we are so motivated to be efficient and succinct, and to sort of describe things in a one-word answer, that the encouragement just to describe it as what it is and does, I think is a great suggestion. There's another question specifically about the Brooklyn Museum, if you have a planting list available to share.
I have meant to post that on the internet for quite a while, and I haven't done it yet. So thank you for that motivation. I will try and make that happen.
Great. And then a related, you could probably answer, what's the coreopsis that was in that?
That was, so there's 5 species and cultivars of coreopsis. And for that project, it was cultivars galore. This was the Brooklyn Museum. It is not only plants that have to be stunningly gorgeous, but they have to be art world gorgeous, right? There was no room for any sort of wild aesthetic. It had to be just like the common person needed to read it as beautiful. So we used quite a few cultivars. And the coreopsis cultivar that we use most, which is a hybrid, is gilded lace. And we had to get it from 3 different nurseries. And it was so much work to get the numbers we needed, and it was so worth it. That baby bloomed for 6 months. 6 months, and it is just the best yellow. It was nuts. And so I can't recommend that cultivar more.
That's great. It'll be gone from the nursery trade next year.
It's already
Yeah.
it spreads rapidly. We can share it. We can
Okay, great. And then can you speak to what you think is the role of local genotype seed and plants in a changing conception of native plants as being hyper local?
I love it. Oh my gosh, I love it. I mean, it's a question of scale and availability and project and context for what your definition and what you're pulling for your plant palette is. But we are hopefully moving into a new house in Connecticut in the spring, and we're going to use all local ecotype, all ecoregion appropriate seed on our land. At least in some places. My husband worked at a botanical garden, so there's like no getting around the metasequoia grove that he is going to plant. That is just going to happen. But yeah, I think I heard this funny story one time of this botanical club in England. And people were arguing about, there was like this section of a university where they wanted to clear away the turf. And then some people were like, oh, we should plant native species there. And the people in this botanical club were like, no, we're not going to plant anything. We are just going to wait. And anything that germinates is what is supposed to be there. And so like, you can go down the rabbit hole, right? Like there's no end to the extremism of that sort of worldview. It just depends on the context and whether, I mean, I'm totally going to try that at some point, and like that's awesome. And but it's not the right strategy for every single context. But right now there's so many great initiatives going on, especially around Massachusetts. I'm sure many of you know about the native seed networks that are especially about Ecoregion 59, which is like so popular. I'm in 58 and we are just forlorn. No one loves us. But 59, like if you're in 59, man, you can find seed like so easily at this point. There's so many smart, brilliant, wonderful people working to get that seed available to folks, and even into the nursery trade.
Awesome. A couple more questions. I will just say that it's a little past 4, so we can stay for a couple more minutes and ask questions and before we wrap it up. So if you have any last minute questions, put them in the chat. I think we've got 2 left. So what do you see as the trending space for yours and similar rhetoric? I see that generating content, language, and storytelling language such as yours that is also filled with real data.
So this is like, is that a question that's like, where do I hope my voice ends up?
Yes.
Is that how you interpret that?
Yeah.
Or if anyone wants to.
Yeah, if whoever wrote that wants to chime in.
Oh, yeah, I'll add to that was me, Sandra. I'll add to that in terms of it's so fresh. Obviously, your voice, your research, your data, and the way you present it feels like there's got to be a trending space, like it's U plus, right? So where is it trending now, if you foresee that happening somewhere, or where do you foresee it happening where it needs to happen? Because obviously the more voices there are, the more impact that can be had with content with real data.
Sure. I mean, I think that where this information needs to go and where these messages need to go is very different from the realm in which I operate. And I am always very grateful for those of you and all the other people who take any of the stuff I say, any of the information I provide, and then share it out to the world. I certainly take so much information from all of you and share it out into the world. And so my little bubble is, I begrudgingly use social media. It's like an unhealthy space for me, but I will use it. But I do pour a lot of energy into my newsletter. And I think that like the goal there is to really try and again, just provide, like, this new study is going in there. There's an awesome new blog from North Creek Nursery. I just saw it today. They put out a blog post about how to how to communicate with homeowners associations and how to like change that dynamic so that homeowners associations are actually pushing for ecological landscapes. And so there's all that information. I'm just trying to give it to you, right? So that everybody else can go out and do that messy work of social media and talking to their neighbors, and please make a TikTok account and like go and take that stuff and put it out into the world. That is my hope.
Okay, last question, I think. So we only have so much jurisdiction here as Hort staff. Drawing in peoples to these issues is so hard. So how do I make biodiversity loss video? How do I make a biodiversity acute? Sorry, how do I make a biodiversity loss acute video?
Oh, a cute video. I
Yeah.
thought you could like acute as in like
Yeah.
sharp.
Cute.
I mean, butterflies, bumblebees, right? Like adorable stick bugs, ladybugs. There's so many charismatic insects out there. So many caterpillars that people love. And, you know, I'm in this awesome group of mostly almost entirely entomologists who are looking at ways to get Americans to like insects. We are unique in our disdain and fear and disgust for insects. And, you know, we've obviously been the victim of like billions of dollars worth of propaganda ever since the 1950s, just shoved at us about how horrible insects are, but that works. And now we hate them. And this is, you know, what's happening. And so I think that the personification of those little creatures, the benefit of them in our lives, the value that they bring to us. Oh, the beauty of a butterfly. Could you imagine walking through a cloud of butterflies? I love saying that to people because they want to do that, right? Even if they're kind of grossed out, they still want to have butterflies in their lives. Another tactic that I found to be very effective and totally manipulative as a parent myself is bringing up their children. If you can talk about, oh, your kids might not experience this, right? Like the way trends are, they are not going to have monarchs, right? We probably won't have monarch butterflies within our lifetimes, at least the migration that we're used to. To talk about that, like the species that are integral in our lives, important to our lives culturally, and talk about how important it is to have our children experience that. That is like a very effective tactic to get people to take action as well.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah. Finding, you know, what motivates people, and you know, what are the places where, you know, they can tune into their own empathy about a topic. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay, I do see one here that we missed. What are your thoughts on the debate around cultivars and the varieties that evolved here? Totally small question.
Yeah, totally. So I feel all ways, right? Like all of the opinions are right as far as I'm concerned. They are both unfortunate in that they often lower the ecological value of these plants to organisms. We don't know how safe they are and whether or not they can interbreed with the wild populations around us. And also that some of them are gorgeous. They make planting native plants easier, more accessible, and more beautiful in a landscape. I would love it if someone could please breed a garden variety thistle. Those, if that happened, right? Like if we had a thistle that we could plant in our gardens, they're beautiful, but they're 10 feet tall and prickly. If we had one, think of the ecological benefit of getting thistle into more landscapes, right? That's real. That's absolutely real. And so, it's both ways, right? As long as I think there's this core group of folks who are keep pushing the industry, keep pushing for local ecotypes, there's still room for those cultivars. And there's room for, I think, folks like, you know, White Flower Farms and Monrovia and all of those like commercial producers to be like, here's your native plant kit. We are going to provide this for you. We're a national organization. I'm talking to people who are just getting into native plants, who don't have any contact with their native plant nurseries, or native plant societies, might be in urban contexts where that's not as accessible. Having those big national groups have native plants for sale, like that can be really helpful for some people. And it's a gateway, right? Like no one thinks that those first steps are the last steps. We all had those first steps, right? Like we all were those people at one point. I know I certainly was buying plants that were super bad for the environment. And I slowly got lured in, and having those plants accessible that just lured me in for beauty, for like double flowers or what have you. That's a way, that is a legitimate method of communicating. So I'm not against it.
Great. Okay. Last question, I swear.
I know, like if anyone wants to hang out, just talk. This would be great. What do you
Okay.
think too?
Yeah. Okay, so when people get inspired to support local ecosystems on their property, they get stalled out feeling that they don't know what to do. I just had a client express this to me today. What resources do you point people to for getting started?
Oh, such a hard one. I mean, of course, there's great books now. There's all the books that we all love, like Claudia West's book and Douglas Tallamy's book. But they are still like more ideologically driven and not like instructional. I'm working on something, but I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to jinx anything. So we'll see what happens. But I think there's so many good resources online, right? Like every native plant nursery, like North Creek and New Moon and all that stuff, and Prairie Moon, they have guides online. There's the Audubon Society where you can go put in your zip code and get a whole list of planting plants for birds. Those are the kinds of resources where I think the first thing to say is you need to find the plants that are going to support the organisms around you, right? That's really what it is the first thing is the planting, right? I'm very hopeful that eventually that there will be resources for people to talk about caring for land as well. And right now, the work is really focused around that act of planting. But yeah, I think it's all coming, right? Like I think so many of us are working on projects, and still there's a lot of resources online. I could make a webpage. I've thought about making a webpage on my website that's like resources, but I feel like the people who go to my website and like read my newsletter are all pretty advanced. Like it's not that those new folks. And so I think that really thinking and respecting where they are and trying to figure out, where they get their information from. And it's YouTube, right? It's like YouTube. And as I said, TikTok, like maybe I could do a better job trying to find out who the awesome YouTube people are, and then like shuttling people to those folks as well.